One of the biggest problems that experts have who want to use a podcast to reach their target audience is syndication. You can write the very best podcast, you can present it, you can have listeners on a few platforms, but if you're not reaching the target audience you need on the largest network possible, then you will have challenges. I'm Justin Hitt with ad briefings, copywriting tips, and inside strategic relations. I'm a podcaster who presents to 4 or 5,000 people a month, targeted customers who are subject matter experts, marketers, uh, people who have consulting services, and who want to reach the largest audience possible. Now, I actually don't know how many episodes are listened to, and that's not what matters to me. What matters to me the most is how many leads and customers I generate from my podcast each month. And that's what should matter to you as a podcaster, as a subject matter expert. Now, you're not selling advertising, you're selling your services. You're not promoting other people's products, you're promoting your product. And so by getting on the largest number of platforms, this is called distribution or syndication, you're going to be able to get the maximum number of listeners. Now, you're going to lose the ability to know how many listeners you have, but listeners are not as important as the leads and prospects who come to your website. So, first, what is podcast syndication and how does it work? Podcast syndication is where you record a podcast on a platform. So that's your publishing platform, that's your podcast hosting platform, and then your podcast is spread to as many other platforms as possible, such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, uh, Spreaker, iHeartRadio. Uh, there's so many different channels, Spotify, Stitcher. All of these platforms have loyal listener bases who want to receive your podcast, who are target prospects for what you offer, but they don't get to listen to your podcast because your podcast doesn't distribute there. Your podcast is not on the maximum number of distribution channels. Even worse is that the descriptions, the backlinks, the keywords, the hashtags, all the metadata that is necessary to show up in search results on those podcast platforms. I don't know if you should listen to podcasts if you're publishing a podcast, or even if you do periodic videos, when you go to search for a video, if you don't have the right keywords, if you don't have the right metadata inside that platform, you're not going to be found as readily as competitor who has that. Another factor, too, as far as podcast syndication, is it's your podcast on all these different platforms linking back to your main website. And then, if it's done properly, you'll get picked up in search engines. Here's the problem, though. Some podcast distribution channels, like SoundCloud, for example, has limitations of how many things you can upload. Um, some want you to upload native. So, for example, you may not think about it this way, but podcast syndication includes Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, other platforms that will allow audio content. There's new platforms. There's other platforms. There's just so many platforms because there is a RSS feed associated with your podcast that, if properly shared and monitored and maintained in all these different platforms, will allow you to reach the maximum number of platforms possible. Now, I'm not going to talk about who's the best podcast provider because some podcast providers do a lot of this for you, but others do not. Whatever platform is fine because that's where you want to record. Your podcast platforms, your podcast hosting is where you're going to be able to most comfortably present your message. Now, again, you could give your audio file to somebody and they can put it online. But in syndication, what's so important is getting your podcast on as many channels as possible with the proper attribution and the proper backlinks so that you can tell where do leads come from. Because Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, all these platforms will let you promote your podcast to specific target audiences, but you don't have the marketing dollars to promote all these different platforms because your podcast is going to be on hundreds of platforms if you do syndication the right way. And you might find that 10 of these platforms are generating a large number of customers, and you don't know what device people are using. You don't know if they're listening on their iPhone or their Android phone, or they're on their desktop computer, or they're on their tablet. None of that is really available to you unless you have your podcast properly attributed on all these channels, linking back to your main website and giving people an opportunity to come back. Now, here's some syndication opportunities you might not be thinking about. Inside your podcast, you're going to have a call to action that might be a direct to your website. So I use, like for this, I'll say if you have any questions, visit www.adbriefings.co.uk. That's a little bit harder to attribute, but you can start using coding. You can use specialized links, but you can also use press releases to promote your podcast. You can send an email to the specific publications that would be interested in a specific topic of your podcast. You can write podcasts specifically for people who have large mailing lists. This is developed around your analytics associated with your syndication so that we can find more places to put your content. Now, again, I do this for my team, does this for subject matter experts, consultants, services providers, professional agents, and such, not for somebody who's trying to get additional advertising revenue. See, a lot of folks think that if they can just get more views, they'll get more ad revenue. But again, a penny here, a penny there is not worth as much as someone picking up the phone and calling your office because they heard your offer in your podcast. It's not as valuable as somebody listening to your podcast and saying, look, that person's a recognized expert. I want to contact them. I want to hire them. So we would rather focus our time and energy on getting as much of the automation associated with syndication done. I want you to be able to post your podcast on whatever publishing platform you use, and it show up on Audible. It shows up on Apple Podcasts. It shows up on Castbox. It shows up on Deezer. It shows up on Google Podcasts. It shows up on iHeartRadio. It shows up on Podcast Addict. It shows up on Podchaser, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, any platform that might be out there, and all you did was record the podcast one time, and the syndication just happened. Now, I don't want my staff sitting around, uploading links and stuff like that. We want as much automation as possible so that when you publish a new podcast, it goes out where it needs to go as quickly as possible. And then we focus our expertise and talent in copywriting and marketing and public relations to then get the word out to specific people who can share with your list a short email or share with their own list a short email, can reference your podcast because it's relevant to their topic. I want to go in there and use analytics to find out what topics you should be covering because that's creating leads on your website. And then what topics you should cover because that's creating subscribers on your podcast channel or reaching out a larger audience. So we're going to have ideas and information that we gain from analytics to help you make better offers, to pick better topics for your podcast, to grow your audience base through understanding buyers in the marketplace. You're not Joe Rogan. You're not, Jack Cornfield. You're not Tim Ferriss. And that's okay. You can still make a fortune using podcasts to find you qualified leads in a marketplace, to get them to go to your website, get them to ask for more information from you, to schedule an appointment, to pay for a consultation. And you can do this without being a technical expert, without knowing how all the integration works, or even knowing what an RSS feed is. You can distribute your podcast to all the available platforms that matter. Now, if you have a podcast, you know that people are contacting you all the damn time saying, we'd love to put your podcast on our platform. We'd love to make you a featured speaker. If you're a true professional who's delivering a high ticket service, maybe you're an accountant and you do a podcast about time saving and money saving tips for small business owners, and you're talking about how to prepare for taxes and stuff like that, and then you're getting a bunch of tax customers. You don't have time to be a special guest or interviewed on somebody's podcast unless you know how to measure the interaction, how to determine where the leads came from, and a system in place to have good quality analytics on your website. So when we talk about podcast distribution, it's not just the channels that are obvious, the podcast channels and podcast players. It's the channels where your prospective customers live and seek for information. And a lot of these platforms have remote players. And what my team will do is we'll go out there and we're going to find content sites. It could be trade associations, it could be magazines, it could be somebody who should be interviewing you, it could be somebody who has already featured content similar to your content, who could put you on their website, can mention you in their newsletter, can send out a broadcast to invite people to see specific content that you offer so that you can focus on valuable content for your audience, informed by analytics, informed by leads generated from your website, and do so without a lot of extra time. Because you and I know when it comes time to keeping these podcasts, the technicals together, there's recording it, there's editing it, there's putting it out on the channels, there is the promotion and the marketing. Now, what my organization primarily does, because I have 4 podcasts, is that my team that's working on my podcast and keeping all the technical stuff straight when it comes to podcast syndication and distribution, they're going to focus on just that. We can get you hooked up with somebody to edit your podcast, but again, I don't think that is as important as getting the message you have. See, if you've got a really nice polished podcast and then you get somebody on the phone for a scheduled appointment or initial consultation or a discovery call, and you're live with them and you don't sound like you did on the podcast, something's going to happen. They're not going to feel comfortable. If you do a podcast, it's reasonably okay. It provides valuable information and resources. And by the way, podcasts are not about teaching. You're not going to make money getting clients, generating leads by only teaching. There's other things that we can show you how to do. But the key is when somebody hears your podcast, we want them to either go in and type in a browser and go to your website and get involved with what you have to offer, or to look in the description and click a link that's properly coded for the podcast channel, for the activity that you're doing, so that we know what the attribution is for that lead, so that you know where to spend your advertising dollars. So once you have an understanding, now I'm assuming you have $1,000 a month or more as advertising dollars to promote your podcast channel, not to generate more subscribers, not to generate more listeners, but to generate sales and leads from your website or from someone calling you on the telephone. You can get this back end stuff taken care of. I'm not spending time making sure my RSS feed is where it's supposed to be. I'm not spending a lot of time doing anything other than serving my clients. And when you're successful at this, you're going to have more billable hours, you're going to have better, higher quality clients, and this podcast network. See, you're going to publish your podcast and it's going to go out to hundreds of different channels, all backlinking to your website. And now when somebody searches for what it is that you have, the optimization is in place, the metadata is in place, and so that they come to buy from your website. Now, we do offer coaching. I'll specifically work with you on what to put in your podcast, how to communicate with your audience, what does the analytics say, what is your audience profiles, because you do need to have a customer avatar of who you're specifically talking with, and then other ways to build the marketing in your business to have systems in place to get you more customers who pay, stay, and refer. So if you're a consultant, if you're a subject matter expert, if you're a recognized expert in the industry, or you want to be a recognized expert in the industry, being able to syndicate your podcast is a valuable resource, a valuable tool to get out there and reach the largest number of qualified buyers. Now, I've talked about how to use podcasts to position yourself as an expert. You can do that very well, but if you never have anybody listen to your podcast, and I giggle a little bit when I say that, because if you do the very best podcast that nobody listens to, then what good is that? Now, there is a challenge that happens today, and I'm going to tell you 2 ways that people solve it. One of the challenges today is that because there's so many different podcast channels, that unless you're a Tim Ferriss, unless you're a Joe Rogan, unless you've got a big giant PBS podcast, it is possible that on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, somebody will go there and there'll be 0 view episodes. There'll be episodes that nobody's listened to on that platform. Now, of course, if your podcast is out on 100 different platforms and you've gotten 10 views on each of the 100, that's a lot of viewers, but it's not likely that every episode is going to hit home like that. There are two ways that people address that. One way is they hire somebody overseas to stimulate the views. And there are scripts and there are ways to get views on a channel. I've seen people try to do that to game the Apple podcast so it's recommended to more people, or the Google podcast so it's recommended to more people. That is not a good idea, because what that's going to do, it's going to disrupt the impressions that we need to know about in order to determine which of these channels are bringing you good prospects. If you've got a podcast episode that's only had 10 views on the Apple channel, and you got one lead from that Apple channel, that tells you something other than if somebody spiked up your views artificially. We don't want the artificial views. We want to be able to get customers if you only got 5 views or you only got 500 views. You don't need to have a podcast that has thousands and thousands of views, because that obscures the demographics of the site. Now, if you do want to get more customers from your podcast and you want to get greater reach from your podcast, all of these platforms pay to play. So you can identify which platform's generating leads, and there's ways that we're going to do that on the back end, by the way, because we're going to ask your leads, how do they hear about you? What is their favorite podcast player? And we build these campaigns for you. You don't have to manage these campaigns. We build them for you. We gather the information, we build out the report, and we help you implement these things. Because if you find out a large number of your customers are listening to you on Apple Podcasts, in order to get more of the same customers, first off, you do retargeting on your website so that you can reach those prospects or people like those prospects on channels like Google AdWords, Facebook, LinkedIn. But now you also go back to Apple Podcasts and promote specific episodes that we know generate leads. So if you've got 100 episodes and you've got 10 episodes that you know generate leads, we're going to go, first off, we're going to know which ones, because we properly attributed the leads, we properly coded everything. It's not a magic system, but you can get pretty good idea that you're getting a lot of new prospects from a certain channel. Then we go out to that channel and we run targeted ad campaigns to boost your channel with actual prospects. Now, when we boost the channel, it's going to lower your conversion rates. We know that. I can teach you how that works. But ultimately, as an expert, you're going to have more qualified buyers come to your website. And I personally don't care if they type in your website. It's how we interact with these people so that you know where they're coming from. And then once you know where they're coming from, we amplify the volume that you get from that channel so that you're going to be pulling whales out of these platforms. If somebody's sitting in an airport listening to your podcast and it really clicks with what they have, what they want to do, we want them to get to raise their hand right then and there and connect with you so that you know that they're interested, they're in your CRM system, they're getting follow-up campaigns, and now you've taken them out of the podcast channel and you get them into your sales funnel. You get them into your lead funnel. You get them into a paid consultation. You get them into a schedule a call. The key thing here is, as an expert, as somebody out in the marketplace who can deliver a high ticket service, we want your calendar full, and you really can't fill your calendar up if you're, of course, faking the stats and getting fake subscribers and stuff like that, or that you're spending a lot of time with the technical issues. Some of these platforms have certain URLs that are necessary, so when someone lands on the page, they can see the subscribe button. Like you can send somebody to the channel that syndicates your podcast, but they land on some weird page that doesn't have a subscribe button. We want to make sure, and we've registered hundreds of channels, we've analyzed the channels. We want to make sure your links work. We want to make sure that your text doesn't get cut off. We want to make sure that that user of that channel has the very best experience. Now, there's an extra value to this before I wrap up, is that when you cultivate these individual channels, which our agency can do for you, you're going to have higher quality inside that channel. And now that channel is going to start promoting you. They're going to start putting you in front of people who are relevant to your prospective lead, the quality lead that you want to get. And then even better, we'll be able to measure the analytics. We'll be able to see on your website who converts. We'll be able to send people to show notes, for example. We'll be able to help you build email lists and really start getting that prospecting game going. If you're tired of cold calling, if you're tired of waiting around and having that trickle effect after you post a podcast rather than a flood of new highly qualified prospects, if you're trying to fill webinars or events, then contact us to ask your questions about podcast syndication. Because if you've got a back catalog of podcasts and we can get those syndicated or we can get those promoted directly to channels that could reach your customers, that is a huge boon. Now, it's not magic. It doesn't happen like right away. It's not one of those things you do one thing and it goes. It's that regular maintenance that demonstrates to these channels that you're here for the long run. It's that regular and periodic podcast that comes out that feeds that audience, that gets them to subscribe and follow up and to come out to your website. These are ongoing services. I got 4 podcasts of my own, and what I'm primarily looking for is 5 podcasters who have a high ticket service who want to spend at least $1,000 a month invested in getting more leads and more sales, because you can easily make that up. Obviously, a customer lifetime value, if you've got a $2,000 service or $3,000 service, will more than pay for the $1,000 investment in promoting your best podcasts. If you're interested in this, visit me at www.adbriefings.co.uk or visit me at www.insidestrategicrelations.com and ask about podcast syndication services. Now, there's no obligation. We'll talk about the challenges you face. You'll find that I write about the challenges that a lot of folks face because podcasting is a valuable way to, at the speed of your voice, to establish yourself as a credible expert, to generate leads in the marketplace, and to ultimately reach a larger set of customers. But it also feeds other things like having your podcast in foreign languages, having your podcast from audio to video or video to audio, having your podcast available in front of audiences that others cannot reach because they haven't done the research that we're talking about. And finally, I want to leave you with something you can start right away. You noticed I gave you 2 different web URLs, and there's no link in here if you're listening to this in the car. But if you remember to visit adbriefings.co.uk or to visit insidestrategicrelations.com and ask your question about podcast syndication services, I'm going to know that you listen to this podcast, because asking for podcast syndication services or asking about podcast syndication services works into my tracking mechanism. So again, even if you don't read the description and all you do is type it in a browser, I'm going to know where you came from and I'll know to invest in that category of work. So that's kind of an example of what we do that's a little bit different than what ad agencies do, because we blend the relationship development and we blend the public relations so that you can drive folks into a funnel. Now, when I promote this podcast or we have staff syndicate this podcast, it doesn't matter what channel it lands on, because once somebody's on the phone with me, I can say, hey, what's your favorite podcast client or listening device? Is there a particular app you listen to podcasts? And now that you're on the phone and I know you're a lead and you say, oh, I love to listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts, I make a little note. And now I know if I want to reach more people like you, smart people who are using podcasts to promote themselves, I can go ahead and go to that channel. Another thing I can do that I want to leave you with is that as I identify these different channels out there, I can say to somebody, what are your favorite copywriting podcasts? And they're going to give me a list. And I ask 10 people, they give me a list. All the common elements there are where I'm going to advertise my podcast about marketing and promotion and copywriting. So do you see how powerful this can be? And I know it's a lot of trouble to record the podcast and get them out there on the network. And you probably don't want to be spending hours every day fixing broken links and chasing down descriptions that aren't right and filling in the blanks of all these different things. But again, that's what my staff have been doing for me for years. And as an agency, that's what we do for our clients. And if you go out to my podcast, you'll notice that not all the podcasts have descriptions. It's okay. They can be haphazard as long as the key popular podcasts and the promotions are all consistent and keep going. So for example, I'm going to get this podcast online. It's going to have a brief description, but if you come back and look at this podcast in a couple months, it might have a full description with a backlink and hashtags. It might be on Amazon as a video. It might be in different places. That is all strategic. Again, we want to focus your limited marketing budget on generating leads and generating sales. so that you can invest $1,000, you can invest $5,000 and get that money back as quickly as possible because your podcast is working as an advertising channel or an advertising resource that goes out to as many channels as possible. So if you've been wondering how to get your podcast syndicated or what the what it takes to get your podcast syndicated or where to distribute your podcast, then contact my offices at the websites I mentioned before, www.adbriefings.co.uk. That's all about podcasting. Or the website, www.insidestrategicrelations.com. That's all about positioning yourself, and simply ask about podcast syndication services. There's no obligation to buy anything. You can schedule a call and I'll chat with you on the phone a little bit about the challenges you faced. I'll ask you a few questions. You can see how it all works. But ultimately, if you fit within the qualifications, we have slots for 5 more podcasts. These are individual podcasts. So if you run more than one, each slot is one podcast. And what we'll do is put my people who are trained, who have all the time in the world to update links, to update descriptions, to make sure that you're in front of the right audience, to help you syndicate that podcast, to identify channels for advertising, to identify customer avatars and new topic ideas from actual functioning analytics so that your podcast can get out there as a marketing tool. And this is the most important part. As soon as you record that podcast, done the right way with distribution, it's now a magical artifact that works for it's an asset for your business because it'll be there for years to come. I've got podcasts out there from 1996 that are still generating leads and still generating traffic to my website. I've got stuff from 2000 that's still generating leads. And then, of course, we can always talk about recycle your marketing. But again, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to do all that work yourself. You can put all your time and energy in the very best, highest quality podcast designed to generate leads, and then we'll help you get it out in front of the right people. We'll use public relations. We're going to use pay-per-click sometimes. We might use sponsored ads on other people's channels. There's a whole array of things that we can do, but the core of it is, do the links work? Can you reference it properly? Is your show notes clean? And ultimately, are we building that network that helps you get into the search engines from multiple perspectives? And then everywhere your prospect turns, they'll find your podcast episodes and they'll find your website and they'll find you as an expert. Again, I'm Justin Hitt, and this has been about syndicating your podcast and the concept of a podcast syndication service so you get maximum distribution and reach the maximum number of customers in a way that you can actually tell what the hell's going on so we can focus your marketing resources for maximum leads and maximum sales. If this is something you're interested in, I'd love to hear your questions. There's no obligation to get involved with us. Like I said, we only have 5 slots available, but I have done a couple other podcasts on this topic that may be useful to you. So if you visit the website, ask your questions, I'll be happy to send you a little bit more detail as well. You don't have to schedule a call with me or anything. You can just get some information if you're just curious about reaching more prospects, getting more from every podcast episode. And this is what we do. We help you build business relationships with your prospects. And so you can have more clients who pay, stay, and refer. So you can build profitable business relationships. And again, I've been Justin Hitt. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.